There is a woman in a psychology study who, when asked to name the happiest year of her life, didn't point to her wedding. She didn't point to the year she got the promotion or the year she bought her first house. She pointed to the year she lost her job, lost her apartment, and moved back into her parents' spare room at 34. Read that again, because it should not make sense. By every external measure, that year was a disaster. No income, no independence, no 5-year plan left standing. And yet, when researchers asked her to describe it, she didn't describe a collapse. She described mornings, a short walk before dinner, actually sleeping through the night for the first time in years, her father laughing at some rerun in the next room, and her, for once, having nowhere else she needed to be. Nothing about that year would have made it onto a resume, and somehow she was doing better than most people, juggling the job, the apartment, and the plan. Sit with that for a second, because it quietly breaks one of the most deeply held assumptions in modern life, the assumption that happiness is something you arrive at, that it's waiting on the other side of the next achievement, the next milestone, the next box checked off a list that never actually runs out of boxes. Her year had none of that. No milestones, no boxes, and it worked better anyway. This isn't a story about romanticizing failure. Losing a job isn't a strategy. What it is a clue, a stripped-down glimpse of what was, and what was left standing turns out to be the same short list of things philosophers have been pointing to for over 2,000 years, and psychologists have spent the last few decades quietly proving they were right about. 7 habits. Nothing exotic. Nothing that requires money, a free weekend, or a personality. Here's the uncomfortable part. Knowing them has never been the problem. Doing them on an ordinary Tuesday, with no one watching and no reward waiting at the end of it, that's where almost everyone quietly falls off. And that gap between knowing and doing is where this entire video lives. By the end of the next hour, you won't have learned anything shocking. What you'll have is something more useful than shock. A clear, honest map of exactly where that gap shows up in your own life, and exactly what closing it looks like, one ordinary day at a time. Let's start with why the gap exists in the first place. Here's something worth understanding before we go any further, because it explains almost everything that follows. None of these 7 habits are urgent. Skipping your walk today costs you nothing today. Staying up late scrolling costs you nothing tonight. Letting a kind word go unsaid costs nothing in the moment it goes unsaid. The bill doesn't arrive immediately. It arrives quietly, months later, stacked so gradually that by the time you feel the weight of it, you can no longer trace it back to any single missed morning. Compare that to a work deadline. A deadline screams. It has a date attached, a consequence attached, a person waiting on the other end of it. A missed walk has none of that. It just sits there, silent, and silence loses to noise almost every time, even when the silent thing matters more in the long run. There's a second reason these habits get pushed aside, and it has nothing to do with time. It's that none of them are impressive. There is no before and after photo for going to bed on time. Nobody posts a story about the specific thing they were grateful for this morning. We live inside a culture that hands out applause for visible effort, the grind, the hustle, the late night, and stays almost completely silent on quiet consistency, even though quiet consistency is the thing actually carrying people through decades of their lives. Keep that in mind as we move through what follows. None of these 7 habits are going to look dramatic while you're doing them. That's not a flaw in the plan. That's the plan. One more thing before we begin, and it costs you nothing to hear it. None of this asks you to take anything on faith. Try each habit for 7 days before deciding whether it earns a place in your life. That's a fair test, and it's the only one that matters here. There's an old story, the kind that gets passed around monasteries long enough that nobody remembers who said it first, about a monk who was asked what he did each morning before anything else touched his day. His answer was almost disappointing in how small it was. He said he sat for 1 minute and named what he already had, not what he wanted, not what was missing, just what was already true. That's the entire habit, stripped down to its smallest form. For most people, the very first thought of the day is some version of dread, the alarm, the traffic already forming somewhere across town, the 40 unread emails that multiplied while you slept. Once that thought sets the tone, the rest of the day tends to follow it, the way water follows the shape of whatever container it's poured into. Not because the day was destined to go badly, but because the first frame of the morning quietly decided what the rest of the footage would look like. Gratitude interrupts that sequence before it has the chance to take hold. Now, there's a version of gratitude that deserves to be pushed back on, and it's worth naming directly, because it's the version that makes most people quit after a week. It's the forced positivity version, the one that asks you to pretend a hard week is actually fine, to paper over real stress with a plastic smile and a list of things you're supposed to feel thankful for. That version doesn't hold up under any real. You can be genuinely stressed about a deadline and still notice, in the same breath, that you woke up this morning with lungs that work without you having to think about it. Both things are true at once. Neither one cancels the other out. The Stoics understood this distinction long before anyone called it gratitude research. Epictetus put it plainly, "A wise man does not grieve for the things which he has not, but rejoices for those which he has." Notice what he isn't saying. He isn't telling you to ignore the things that are genuinely wrong. He's pointing out that the absence of one thing shouldn't be allowed to blind you to everything else quietly still working in your favor. The modern research lines up with the ancient observation almost exactly. Psychologist Robert Emmons spent decades at UC Davis studying this, and his findings keep landing in the same place. People who name specific things they're grateful for consistently report higher life satisfaction than people who don't, not because their circumstances changed, but because their attention did. Think of your mind as a camera that can only hold one thing in frame at a time. Point it at what's missing, and that fills the entire picture. Point it at what's working, and the whole scene shifts, even though nothing outside the frame has actually changed. This matters more than it sounds like it should, because your attention isn't a neutral recording device. It doesn't passively capture your day the way a camera captures a room. It actively decides what counts as your day. Two people can sit through the exact same Tuesday, same meetings, same weather, same commute, and walk away having lived through two entirely different days. One remembers the printer that jammed and the meeting that ran 40 minutes long. The other remembers the coworker who quietly covered for them and the 10 minutes they managed to steal for a walk at lunch. Ask either of them how their week is going, and you'll get two completely different answers, despite having lived through nearly identical circumstances. That gap isn't dishonesty. It's simply where their attention. Here's where most people get this wrong when they try it. They keep it vague. "I'm grateful for everything" doesn't stick to anything, which means it doesn't change anything. Specificity is what makes gratitude functional instead of decorative. Try naming 3 things tomorrow morning before you check your phone. The particular smell of coffee brewing. A 5-minute call you get to make to your mother later that day. A bed that was actually warm, small, specific, real. If you want to push the habit further, try naming one thing you'd normally complain about instead. Traffic that hands you 15 unplanned minutes alone with your thoughts. a slow morning that forces you to actually sit down and eat breakfast instead of inhaling it standing at the counter. This version is harder, and that difficulty is exactly why it works. It trains your attention to find something worth keeping, even inside the parts of the day you'd normally write off entirely. Some people take this one step further and write a single sentence each morning describing something they're looking forward to later that day. Nothing large, just one small anchor point. It gives the mind something to move toward instead of only something to survive. A co-worker of mine picked up this exact habit during a genuinely difficult stretch at work. And the strange part, she told me, wasn't that the stretch itself got any easier. It didn't. What changed was that she stopped dreading every single morning of it equally. Some mornings had an anchor now. That turned out to be enough. There's a ripple effect worth mentioning before we move on, because it's arguably the more important half of this habit. Gratitude tends to move outward when you let it. Thank someone specifically, not the automatic, reflexive thanks we toss around all day, but something closer to, people remember being seen in that specific way, and that memory tends to shape how they treat the next person in front of them. A private journal entry can't do that. Spoken gratitude closes a small social loop that silent gratitude leaves permanently open. Give this 7 mornings. Not for a dramatic transformation. You're not looking for that by day 7. You're looking for something quieter and more useful. That's usually the earliest sign this habit has started working, long before it shows up as anything larger. Here's a question worth actually pausing on, instead of skimming past. When was the last time you moved your body simply because it felt good? Not because you were trying to burn something off, not because you were correcting something about how you look, but purely because motion itself felt like relief. If you had to sit and think about that for a moment, you're not unusual. Most people's relationship with movement got hijacked somewhere along the way by appearance, by a number on a scale, by a vague sense of obligation that never quite specifies what it's actually for. Somewhere in that hijacking, the plain, felt experience of moving got lost entirely. Most people treat the mind and the body as 2 separate departments, mental health handled over here, physical health handled over there, each with its own separate fix. That split sounds tidy, but it doesn't actually hold up under any real scrutiny. Your brain and your body are in constant conversation with each other, whether you're paying attention to it or not, and movement is one of the clearest ways to steer that conversation somewhere better. You don't need to become an athlete. That belief is probably the single biggest thing blocking people from starting at all. A 10-minute walk after dinner counts. Stretching on your bedroom floor counts. Dancing badly in your kitchen while pasta water comes to a boil counts. This is worth repeating plainly, because so much fitness culture pushes the opposite message, that framing does real damage. It convinces people that 10 minutes isn't worth the effort of starting, so they wait for some mythical free hour that rarely arrives, and the habit never gets off the ground at all. 10 honest minutes, done daily, will outperform 60 minutes done twice a month. Every single time, regardless of how the math looks written down on paper. There's real physiology underneath this, not just encouragement. Movement triggers the release of endorphins and serotonin, and this isn't folk wisdom passed down through gym culture. It's basic, well-documented neurochemistry. It's one of the few tools available to you that can shift your... There's a second layer to this that most people miss entirely. Movement restores a sense of agency. When life feels chaotic and largely out of your hands, moving your body is one thing you can still choose, fully and completely, without needing anyone else's permission or involvement. You decide to walk around the block. Nobody else has a say in that decision. That small private act of choosing something for yourself, even something as modest as 10 minutes outside, reminds you that you are not entirely at the mercy of your circumstances. This matters most on exactly the days left alone long enough. Unreleased stress doesn't simply dissolve on its own. It tends to calcify into the kind of chronic tightness people eventually mistake for a permanent feature of their body, rather than something that arrived and could just as easily leave. There's a trap worth naming directly here, because it catches almost everyone at some point. The days you need this habit most are usually the exact days you feel least capable of doing. Stress and low motivation tend to arrive together, which means this habit has to survive on structure rather than mood. Deciding on a calm day that the evening walk happens, regardless of how you feel later that night, removes the decision from the precise moment you're least equipped to make it well. This is also where people sabotage themselves without realizing it. They set the bar absurdly high, 5 miles or nothing counts, and guarantee failure. Motivation isn't reliable day to day, and building a habit on top of something unreliable is asking for it to collapse. A habit small enough that skipping it feels harder than simply doing it. That's the version that survives. Start with 10 minutes. A walk after dinner, outdoors if you're able to manage it. There's a specific reason for pairing sunlight with movement rather than doing either alone. Natural light exposure, particularly earlier in the day, helps set your internal clock, the same internal clock that governs when you feel alert and when you feel sleepy. A treadmill in a windowless gym gets your body moving, but it skips that second signal entirely. 10 minutes around her block each evening, nothing more ambitious than that. 6 months later, she'd quietly added a second walk without ever consciously deciding to. That's a strange, recurring feature of habits like this one. They rarely announce themselves. Nobody wakes up one morning and thinks, movement fixed my mood. It simply stops being something you have to talk yourself into, and by the time you notice the shift, it's already been true for a while. Sleep scientist Matthew Walker spent decades studying this at UC Berkeley, and one of his findings deserves far more attention than it usually gets. During REM sleep, the dreaming stage, the brain appears to strip the raw emotional charge off a memory while leaving the memory itself intact. Skip enough of that stage, and the stripping process doesn't fully complete. The memory stays, so does the sting attached to it. That single finding might explain why chronically underslept people don't just feel tired, they feel raw. Everything lands harder than it should, and it isn't a metaphor to say so. Walker's research suggests the emotional tagging on a memory is designed to fade through proper REM cycling, while the factual content of the memory itself stays exactly where it was. Skip that stage repeatedly, and you end up walking around carrying full-strength emotional weight attached to things that should have softened days or weeks ago. Sit with that for a moment, because it's a genuinely strange thought once it lands. A rough day you had 2 weeks ago might still be quietly shaping your mood right now, not because you're consciously replaying it, but because the sleep debt from that stretch was never fully repaid, and the emotional residue attached to it never received the processing it needed. We live inside a culture that treats exhaustion as a badge of honor. Running on 4 hours of sleep gets treated as impressive rather than alarming, proof of dedication rather than a warning sign. But no amount of gratitude, no amount of movement, fully compensates for a brain that is chronically starved of sleep. Sleep isn't optional maintenance you can skip when things get busy. It's the foundation everything else in this list is sitting on. There's a particular kind of pride that attaches itself to sleep deprivation specifically, and it's worth calling out because nothing else on this list gets treated the same way. Nobody brags about skipping meals for a week, or about ignoring basic hygiene for days at a time. Those would immediately read as warning signs to anyone paying attention. But "I only slept 4 hours" often gets said with something close to pride, as though it proves how much someone has going on. It doesn't prove that. It simply means tomorrow is going to be harder than it needed to be, and the people around that person will likely feel the difference before they consciously register it themselves. Think back to the last time you were seriously underslept. Small annoyances probably felt close to unbearable. Maybe you snapped at someone over something that, on a properly rested day, wouldn't have registered as worth reacting to at all. That's not a character flaw surfacing. That's ordinary sleep deprivation doing exactly what it does to every human brain, without exception. So what actually helps? Nothing complicated. Same bedtime, same wake time, weekends included. That's essentially the whole practice. Everything else is detail layered on top of that one foundation. Screens push bedtime later, without most people ever noticing it happening, because bright light at night convinces your brain it's still afternoon. Work from bed, scroll from bed, argue with a group chat from bed, and your brain quietly starts treating that entire room as a place associated with alertness rather than rest. It's a small fix with a genuinely outsized payoff. Answering one late email from bed feels harmless enough in the moment, but do it often enough, and the room itself starts triggering low-grade alertness the instant you walk in. Whether or not you're actually doing it, the body learns environments faster than most people give it credit for, and it doesn't distinguish between working here and resting here nearly as cleanly as we'd like to believe. Rested people also tend to be more generous, which is worth remembering the next time an argument starts over something small. Not a minor detail when you consider how many disagreements begin. 8 hours isn't realistic for everyone right now, and that's fine. 30 minutes earlier still counts. Don't wait for the perfect night to begin either. There won't be one. Some nights will stay short no matter what you do. Work runs late, a child wakes up, sleep gets interrupted by things entirely outside your control. This habit was never about protecting a flawless 8 hours every single night. It's about protecting the average across a month, instead of writing off the entire effort the first time one night goes sideways. Picture the scene. You're at the grocery store, tired, running behind schedule, and the cashier in front of you looks about as worn down as you feel. You could simply get through the transaction in silence, or you could say, "Long shift?" and actually wait to hear the answer. 4 seconds. That's the entire habit. Writer Alan Lux surveyed thousands of volunteers back in the 1980s and identified something researchers now refer to as the helper's high, a small, measurable physical lift that follows an act of kindness toward someone else, comparable to what shows up. One important caveat before going further: kind is not the same thing as a doormat. You can hold a firm boundary and still be a genuinely kind person, regardless of what any group chat tries to convince you otherwise. There's a version of kindness that regularly gets mistaken for weakness, and it deserves to be named directly. Saying no to something calmly, without over-explaining or apologizing your way through it, is often the kindest thing you can offer someone, because it spares them the slow resentment that builds when you say yes while quietly meaning no. People sense that resentment eventually, even when it's never spoken aloud. It's worth noticing how often these two things get confused in ordinary life. Someone agrees to help move a friend's apartment for the 3rd weekend running, exhausted and quietly resentful the entire time, and calls that kindness. Real kindness might have sounded more like, "I can't this weekend, but I'm free next Saturday." The version that costs you your own peace isn't automatically. None of this requires money. It requires attention, in a world specifically built to pull your attention somewhere else. Someone treated kindly tends to pass that treatment on to the next person they meet. You'll never personally witness that chain reaction play out. That doesn't mean it isn't running quietly in the background of dozens of interactions you'll never see. It's easy to dismiss this as wishful thinking, the kind of sentiment that sounds pleasant in a video but doesn't survive contact with real scrutiny. Except the underlying mechanism is fairly ordinary and well documented. People's moods genuinely do shift based on small interactions, and shifted moods genuinely do carry forward into the next interaction that follows. None of that requires anything mystical. It's simply how emotional states tend to transfer between people who spend even a few seconds in each other's company. Consider the barista who receives one genuine compliment during an otherwise thankless shift. There's a reasonable chance that small moment changes how she speaks to the next customer in line, who then carries a slightly better mood into a meeting, who then goes home a little less short-tempered with their child that evening. None of that will ever show up in any data set. It's simply quietly true. You won't get credit for most of the kindness you offer. That's essentially the deal. It works anyway. There's a persistent myth worth dismantling directly, that more connections automatically make you happier, that the busier and fuller your social calendar looks, the fuller your life actually is. This myth has intuitive pull, which is exactly what makes it dangerous. A full calendar is easy to measure. Whether any of those interactions actually meant something is much harder to measure. So people default to counting what's countable and quietly mistake that count for genuine connection. The Harvard study of adult development, currently directed by psychiatrist Robert Waldinger, has followed the same group of people for over 80 years, tracking their careers, health, income, and relationships across entire lifetimes. The single strongest predictor of long-term happiness that emerged from all of it wasn't wealth. It wasn't career achievement. It was the quality of a small number of close relationships, not the number of names on a contact list, not how many people show up to a birthday party. Depth, consistency, a handful of relationships that were actually real. Here's the uncomfortable part. Modern life is engineered almost perfectly to erode exactly this. We are more digitally connected than any generation in history, and loneliness rates keep climbing regardless. Texting someone isn't the same as sitting across from them. Liking a post isn't the same as noticing their voice catch when something is actually bothering them. Part of the problem is that digital connection mimics the feeling of closeness without delivering the substance behind it. A group chat can make you feel plugged in for an entire day, while the actual depth of any single relationship inside that chat quietly thins out from a lack of real, undivided attention. It's entirely possible to feel surrounded and still feel unseen, and a great many people are living inside exactly that contradiction without ever being able to name it clearly. The fix isn't deleting every app or disappearing off the grid entirely. It's simpler and far less dramatic than that. It's making sure at least a few relationships in your life still receive the kind of undivided attention a screen simply cannot fake, even if everything else in your life stays exactly as digital and convenient as it already is. You've likely experienced this yourself at some point. An entire evening spent next to someone, both phones out, barely present with each other despite sitting inches apart. That's the myth in action, made visible. Proximity is not connection. That distinction is worth sitting with for longer than it probably takes to hear it. Real connection requires presence, and presence has become genuinely rare. Aristotle wrote about exactly this over 2,000 years ago, and the observation still holds without needing a single word updated. In poverty and other misfortunes of life, true friends are a sure refuge. He wrote that before phones existed, before likes existed, before anyone could mistake a notification for an actual conversation. And yet the observation lands today with the same weight it carried then, which says something worth noticing about how little the fundamentals of connection have changed, even as every tool surrounding them has changed completely. Practically, this often means saying no to other things, fewer hours online, a little less optimizing of your own schedule. That trade-off feels uncomfortable inside a culture that prizes constant visible output above almost everything else. But the research keeps pointing in the same direction, without exception. People rarely reach the end of their lives wishing they had worked more. They wish they had shown up more consistently, for the people already standing in front of them. None of this requires a grand gesture either. It's rarely one spectacular vacation or one perfect, deep conversation that makes a relationship feel close. It's the slow accumulation of small, unremarkable days where someone simply showed up anyway. That's what actually gets remembered, even if none of those ordinary days felt significant while they were happening. A weekly 15-minute call to a parent, instead of a text that just says "miss you." Dinner with a close friend, phones left in a bag on the counter for the whole meal, asking a genuine follow-up question instead of quietly steering the conversation back toward yourself. None of it is complicated. All of it requires actually choosing it.